Hey everyone, this is Andy Hall. With me today is Jason Foux. So, for people who aren't acquainted with you or your podcast, Dragons in Genesis, you want to just give them a summary?
Yeah, so I have a podcast called Dragons in Genesis, and the easiest way to find it is to go to any podcast app like Apple Podcasts, Google, Stitcher, Spreaker, anything like that, and just search Dragons in Genesis, and you'll see a big orange logo with a silhouette of Godzilla attacking Jerusalem. You can't miss it. And as I tell people, it is the number one secular Bible study podcast with Godzilla on the logo. I figure if you add enough qualifiers, I'll be number one by default, and that's the best way to win. So that the podcast is basically a secular Bible study comparative mythology podcast. And what I do is I go through the Bible and like starting with Genesis chapter 1 and just going through. And I touch on all of these different Bible stories, what they mean within the context of the Bible, within the context of that particular book, the historic context, and of course, the mythological context. Like what other Near Eastern stories that were around at the time could have influenced this or inspired this story? Or how does it relate to these other stories? You know, how well does it fit in to popular myths that were around at the time?
Mhm.
And I don't skip anything. Like I cover every single chapter. So I don't go from Noah's Ark to the Tower of Babel because there's like a whole chapter in between there that no one ever talks about of all this, begats. And there's actually a little bit of interesting stuff in there. Not too much that's interesting. That's a boring part. But I don't skip that part. It's all there. And so anything I touch on, I do it in its entirety. And so the podcast, as far as the Bible is concerned, has gone from the first chapter of Genesis to the last chapter of 2nd Samuel. But occasionally I take little detours because I get bored with, the Bible, and I'll jump off into something else. Like last year I did this, I think, 5-part series about this transition in theology that occurred around the time of the Babylonian exile. And this year, I took what was supposed to be a slight detour, but has lasted most of the year, to talk about Enoch, which is absolutely bonkers. And that's a technical term. You can look it up. Bonkers. It means not biblically, I don't know, something. It's bonkers, okay?
It's not orthodox, to say the least.
Right. That's the word I'm looking for. The caffeine hasn't kicked in just yet.
So who was Enoch, dude? Who was he?
So Enoch pops up basically one time in the Bible, and he's barely mentioned. Okay, and what it is in the genealogy going from Seth to Noah. So you have this real fun story where Cain hits his brother Abel over the head with a rock. And you think, oh man, we're finally getting some excitement in this Bible. And then it's like, okay, so he went off to, be alone, yet started a whole city. And then he had another brother named Seth. And then it goes into this whole big chapter of begats, Seth begat so-and-so, begat so-and-so, begat so-and-so. And a little bit before it gets to Noah, it says that there was a guy named Enoch. And each person, in this little genealogy, they live like incredible lengths of time, like 800, 900 years, stuff like that. And for that section, Enoch has an incredibly short lifespan, 365 years. But what's really weird is that for all these other people, it says that they died. They lived so many hundreds of years. Then they gave birth to so-and-so. And then at the age of, 800 years, they died. With Enoch, it says he lived 365 years, and then he went up and walked with God. Doesn't say he died. It said he walked with God. He went up, he ascended. And it's like, okay, that's weird. And then the story moves on, and it doesn't tell us why this dude just walked off into heaven, how he ascended. It doesn't say anything special about him. And then he has a son, Lamech, and then Methuselah, and then Noah. Okay, and those are his descendants. And it just kind of leaves us. But around this same time, right before we get to the story of Noah in Genesis 6:1-3, it tells us that around this time, some angels, some sons of God, sons of El, came down to earth, and they had sex with human women, and it created a race of giants called the Nephilim. And God realized that this was bad and had to purge the earth, and so he's going to send the flood. And then we move on to the story of Noah. He builds this ark, and it doesn't say anything about these giants or the sons of God or Enoch in that entire story. So it looks like something's missing. Like there's a reference to it, and scholars had been pointing this out for centuries, that these passages look weird. They are referencing something that no longer exists. And so Enoch is this weird legendary character in Jewish mythology that sort of fell out of the Bible. And the Old Testament doesn't really have much about him other than this one little passage about how he lived 365 years. Yes, there's a connection to the days of the year in there. And then he went up into heaven and wasn't on the earth anymore. And that's basically it. That's all we know until 1769, when a guy named James Bruce from Scotland went to Ethiopia in search of the headwaters of the Nile. And it was almost like a clickbait article. What he found next will blow your mind. Between northern Egypt and Ethiopia, there are no Christians. So you've got 1,000 miles of Africa with all kinds of different religions there, and no trace of Christianity in between. And he goes in there, and the place is littered with Christians. They have temples, they have churches, they have Bibles. And their Bibles are different. They have a lot of the same books, but then they have books that he had never heard of. No one had ever heard of before. And one of these books was this fascinating thing called the Book of Enoch. And it was thrown right there in the middle of their Old Testament. And it starts filling gaps in the story. Like, why did Enoch go up into heaven? Why did he live 365 years? What happened with the Nephilim, these giants, the sons of God, all this stuff, And all of a sudden, people are going nuts because the entire view of the Bible begins to shift, because we suddenly start to get a clearer picture of the mythology that was no longer in the Old Testament. And so that's sort of who Enoch was.